There is a generation of people walking around today that almost nobody talks about. Everyone seems to have an opinion about the boomers. Everyone has a theory about the millennials. And Gen Z, bless them, record everything, so you cannot miss them even if you try. But there is another group of people sitting quietly in the middle, born somewhere between 1965 and 1980, and they are the quietest, strongest, most misunderstood generation I have ever watched grow up. And I really did watch them grow up. Literally. They came through my shoe repair shop in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, starting in the mid-70s. Little kids with apartment keys hanging on strings around their necks, dragging their school shoes through my door with the soles barely attached. No parent anywhere in sight. They would sit in the chair near the window and wait while I repaired their shoes. And they did not fidget. They did not complain. They did not ask me to call their mother. They simply waited quietly, like small adults trapped inside children's bodies. Back then, I did not know what to call them. Nobody did. Today we call them Generation X. And I have 10 things to tell you about them. 10 truths. Because I believe they are the most misunderstood people alive. And most of them will never tell you this themselves. That is part of the problem. And that silence they learned as children became a habit that stayed with them. It is a habit that is extremely difficult to unlearn. I notice it now in the Gen X adults I know. They rarely ask for help. They almost never lean on other people, and if you offer help they become uncomfortable, like you caught them doing something private. That independence everyone praises actually began as loneliness, and somewhere deep inside many of them, it still is. If you are Gen X, and you are listening to this, asking for help is not weakness. I know you were taught the opposite. I know that empty apartment trained you to solve everything yourself. But carrying everything alone is not strength. It is simply a habit. And habits can always be changed. Truth number 2, they do not trust institutions. And honestly, they have good reasons not to. I clearly remember 1974. I was sitting in my shop listening to the radio. I always kept the radio on. And then Nixon resigned. Watergate. The President of the United States had been lying. And everyone knew it. And the kids heard it too. They heard their parents discussing it at the dinner table. They heard teachers talking about it in the hallways. And the message they absorbed was simple. The people in charge will lie directly to your face and expect you to thank them for it. And it did not stop there. Iran-Contra, the AIDS crisis that the government ignored until thousands had already died, the savings and loan scandal, the dot-com crash, the financial crisis of 2008. Every decade something happened that confirmed Gen X was right. Do not trust the system. The system does not care about you. Truth number 1 is that they practically raised themselves, and it cost them more than most people realize. In my neighborhood, Bay Ridge, in the 1970s, there was a boy named Danny Kowalski. His Polish family lived above a small deli on 73rd Street. Danny was maybe 9 or 10 the first time he walked into my shop alone. Not with his mother, not with his father, completely alone. He had a key hanging on a shoelace around his neck, and a pair of sneakers that needed repairing. I asked him, "Where's your mother, Danny?" He said, "Work." I asked, "Your father?" He answered, "Work." And that was the entire conversation. No drama, no complaint, just a simple fact. His parents were working and he was taking care of his own business at 9 years old. Danny was not unusual. He was typical. By the late 1970s, almost every kid who came into my shop after 3 o'clock arrived alone. They would unlock their apartments with those keys around their necks. They made themselves a snack. They did their homework on the kitchen counter. Then they wandered the neighborhood until dinner. Nobody was watching them. Nobody was calling to check on them. And those kids figured everything out themselves. They cooked their own food. They solved their own arguments. They bandaged their own scraped knees. They really did not have a choice. But here is what people rarely talk about. When you teach a child to survive alone, you also teach them that being alone is normal. And when something becomes normal in childhood, it quietly follows you into adulthood. Many Gen X adults can sit alone in a room for hours and feel perfectly comfortable, not because they dislike people, but because solitude was their training ground. They learned early that if something needed to be handled, they would probably be the one handling it, and that lesson stayed with them. Truth number 3 is that they developed humor as armor. Dark humor, sarcastic humor, the kind of humor that sometimes makes other generations uncomfortable. But that humor did not appear randomly. It was a defense mechanism. When you grow up in uncertainty, when adults around you are overwhelmed, when nobody explains what is happening, humor becomes a way to survive the confusion. I remember a boy who used to visit my shop named Marcus Webb. Marcus always had something funny to say, always a joke ready. One afternoon in 1983, he came in with a broken heel on his boot. I asked him what happened. He said he slipped while running through the rain. Then he laughed and said, "At least the rain washed away the blood." I asked him what blood he meant. He shrugged and told me he had fallen earlier that week and sliced his knee open on a piece of metal. He had wrapped it himself with paper towels and electrical tape. Then he laughed again. That was Gen X humor. Pain first, joke second. Truth number 4 is that Gen X learned very early not to trust companies. And this lesson came from watching what happened to their parents. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, factories started closing all across the country. Men who had worked 20 or 30 years in the same place were suddenly sent home with a cardboard box and a handshake. Promises of lifetime employment vanished overnight. Pensions disappeared. Health insurance was suddenly gone, and Gen X teenagers were watching all of it. They saw their fathers come home quiet and angry. They heard their mothers whispering about bills late at night. They understood something important long before anyone tried to teach it to them. Companies are not families. Companies are businesses, and businesses will always protect themselves first. I remember a young man named Jeff Morales. Jeff used to come into my shop in the late 1980s. He had just started working at an auto repair garage down the street. One afternoon he told me something I have never forgotten. He said, I work hard while I'm there, but I will never give them my loyalty. I asked him why. He said, because loyalty is something they will never return. Jeff was 22 years old when he said that, and I remember thinking he sounded cynical. Now I realize he was simply realistic. Gen X workers learn to rely on their own skills rather than promises from employers. They kept their resumes ready. They built side businesses. They prepared for the moment the job disappeared, because they had seen that moment before, and they knew it would come again. Truth number 5 is that Gen X became very different parents from the ones who raised them, because they clearly remember what it felt like to grow up mostly alone. They remember the quiet apartments. They remember the empty kitchens. They remember the afternoons that felt endless. And because they remember those moments so clearly, they made a quiet promise to themselves. Their children would never feel that same loneliness. If you watch Gen X parents carefully, you will notice something interesting. They are deeply involved in their children's lives. They attend the games. They show up at the school events. They help with homework late at night. They ask questions. They listen. But at the same time, they are also trying not to control everything. They want their children to be independent, because independence is the one gift their own childhood gave them. So they live in a strange balance. They want to protect their children from the loneliness they experienced, but they also want their children to develop the strength that loneliness created. And sometimes they worry they are not getting that balance right. I see this when Gen X parents come into my shop today. Now they arrive with their teenagers, and they look at those teenagers with a mixture of pride and quiet concern. They want to give their children everything they never had, but they also know that struggle is what made them strong. That is a difficult puzzle for any parent to solve. Truth number 6 is that boredom became their greatest teacher. Gen X children were bored more often than any generation before or after them. There were fewer organized activities, no smartphones, no streaming services, no endless scroll of entertainment. When they finished their homework, there was often nothing planned, just a long afternoon and their imagination. So they built things. They took apart radios. They experimented with bicycles and engines. They learned guitar chords in dusty garages. They formed garage bands that were terrible at first. They drew comic books. They wrote stories. They explored empty lots and abandoned buildings. And all that boredom created creativity. When you remove constant stimulation, the mind begins inventing things. Many of the musicians, filmmakers, writers and entrepreneurs you know today came from that generation. They had time to think, time to experiment, time to fail without anyone watching. Today, boredom is treated like a problem. Parents rush to fill every minute with structured activities. But boredom was where Gen X learned how to build their own world. Truth number 7 is that Gen X formed incredibly strong friendships. And those friendships were built in a very different way from what we see today. They were not created through group chats or social media posts. They were formed outside, on sidewalks, in backyards, on basketball courts, in basements and garages. They spent entire afternoons together without parents supervising them. They argued, they competed, they laughed, they solved problems together, and slowly those friendships became something deeper. Because when you grow up figuring out the world together, you develop a bond that is difficult to break. I still see groups of Gen X friends walking through the neighborhood sometimes. They are older now, gray hair, reading glasses. But when they stand together, they instantly become teenagers again. The jokes return, the old stories appear, the laughter sounds exactly the same. Those friendships survived because they were built before life became so busy and before technology started replacing face-to-face connection. And that kind of friendship is becoming rare today. Truth number 8 is that many Gen X adults carry a quiet sense of guilt about their parents. Not anger, not resentment, something softer than that. Guilt. Because as they grew older, they slowly began to understand something about those empty apartments and those long afternoons alone. Their parents were not careless. Their parents were overwhelmed. Two incomes became necessary. Costs were rising. Jobs demanded more hours. And many parents believed they were doing the right thing by working harder to provide a better life. Gen X children did not fully understand that at the time, but as adults they began to see the situation differently. They saw the exhaustion their parents carried. They saw the sacrifices their parents made. And many of them realized that those lonely afternoons were not created by neglect. They were created by necessity. And that realization brought a strange mix of emotions, understanding, gratitude, and quiet regret. Because there were conversations they never had, questions they never asked, moments they assumed would always be available later. But later sometimes never arrives. Truth number 9 is that Gen X rarely complains about their lives. Not because their lives were easier. Often the opposite is true. But complaining was never something they learned to do. When you grow up solving problems alone, you develop a habit of handling things quietly. You fix what you can fix. You endure what you cannot change, and you keep moving forward. That is why many Gen X adults appear calm during difficult situations. They have already practiced resilience since childhood. Truth number 10 is that they became one of the most adaptable generations ever, because the world changed dramatically during their lifetime. They grew up without the internet. Then they learned to use computers. They adapted to email. Then smartphones arrived. Then social media. And they adjusted to every change along the way. They did not grow up with these technologies, but they learned them anyway. And they did it while raising families, building careers, and caring for aging parents. That ability to adapt quietly is something people often overlook. Gen X does not ask for recognition. They rarely demand attention. They simply keep moving forward. And maybe that is why people misunderstand them, because the quiet generations are often the ones carrying the heaviest responsibilities. If you are Gen X and you are listening to this, I want you to know something. Your strength did not come from nowhere. It came from every afternoon you spent figuring life out on your own, from every challenge you faced without someone explaining what to do, from every moment you learned to stand on your own feet. And if the world sometimes forgets that, it does not change the truth. You survived, you adapted, and you kept going. That is something worth remembering.